In the previous episodes, we saw how some human traits represent evolutionary anomalies that are difficult to explain. But that's not all. Even the brain, the organ that was crucial for our rise in the animal world and that most characterizes us, 200,000 years ago, at the dawn of our species, was not so efficient and decisive for our survival. To try to look at the entire evolutionary path of our species from a different perspective, and to offer a possible explanation for all the anomalies we've found, we need to take a small step back. Our species, in addition to the characteristics already mentioned, has another very peculiar one. Homo sapiens shows pronounced neotenic traits. What does that mean? Neoteny is the phenomenon by which, even in adulthood, a species retains childlike traits.
We have very few examples of neotenic species in nature. One of these is the axolotl, which is an amphibian found in some Mexican lakes. What is it? It's basically a sort of eternal tadpole, and it remains in an immature state even though it becomes sexually mature. There's a biological explanation for why the axolotl behaves this way, simply because the lakes have limited energy resources. So for the axolotl, from a survival point of view, it's advantageous to remain immature so that, let's say, it can lower its energy consumption. But that's a very particular case. If we look at our own species, then why should our species remain neotenic? There's no real reason. So if we need to, we can explain the neoteny of our species in another way. Because it's true that in nature there are no examples of neoteny in nature. But it's also true that there are still some examples of neoteny. And almost all of them are examples of domesticated species.
Let's take the dog and the wolf, for example. They both come from the same animal. Their split happened about 12,000 years ago when humans started selecting the specimens best suited to living with humans and performing certain tasks. Domesticated species like dogs show anatomical and behavioral characteristics that are very different compared to their wild cousins. Dogs, compared to wolves, have floppy and smaller ears, shorter muzzles, curled tails, and smaller teeth. A reduction in the physical and structural differences between male and female specimens, docility, and more frequent estrous cycles. Mating tends to no longer be seasonal or tied to specific times of the year.
The problem was, it had already been raised in Darwin's time. Someone had pointed it out to him. He knew it very well. He knew because he knew very well how. What were the typical traits of a domesticated species, and what were the types of selective forces underlying domestication or underlying natural selection? Except that Darwin always refused to consider the human being a domesticated species. A few decades ago, this issue was brought up again in the literature, and it was found that by comparing, for example, our species not with one of its predecessors, but with a slightly older cousin like Neanderthal. To give an example, when we are compared, we show numerous traits of a domesticated species. So what does that mean?
All the traits we find in domesticated species are present in humans and become evident if we compare humans to one of their ancestors, like Neanderthal. Our species compared to a Neanderthal shows a more slender profile. Our whole face appears softer, our brow ridges are smaller, as are our nose and our teeth. In short, if we compare Neanderthal to Homo sapiens, we will clearly notice the classic phenotypic signs of a species that has undergone a process of domestication. But that's not all. If we wanted to compare humans to their closest relative in nature, the ape, we would clearly notice that neotenic traits are more prevalent in humans. In fact, if we look at a baby ape and observe its face, we notice that it is much more similar to that of a Homo sapiens than to an adult specimen.
So someone might say, but no, domesticated? By whom? This embarrassing question is answered with something that is rather complex to understand, and that is self-domestication. Self-domestication is a sort of revisiting of that phenomenon we talked about earlier. That is sexual selection, also associated with social selection. What is social selection? It's about preferring within a group, like a tribe, for example, those individuals who are less aggressive, those who are more docile, those who are gentler. So in other words, to kick out of the group those who, let's say, caused trouble or were a nuisance. And this created it's like a kind of filtering process. Natural selection no longer plays a role now, which made it possible to select all those individuals who were a bit more docile. And being docile is one of the typical characteristics of being domesticated. Now, even here, in my opinion, it's a bit debatable, because the fact that we are docile, well, that's something we like to tell ourselves, because we are the only living beings who wage war. It doesn't exist in the animal world. War doesn't exist.
If it's true that natural selection has eliminated all those traits that made humans potentially aggressive, it's also true, though, that humans, thanks to their technical skills, have regained what nature took away from them, and through tools and devices. Today, humans are potentially the most aggressive living beings on the planet, both towards their own species and towards others.
So, what is this domestication due to? And here, how should I put it? We could dangerously venture into areas that I'm not familiar with. So, however, there are some possibilities that we could bring up without having to resort to who knows what, how should I say, fringe theory. Humans domesticated themselves, or were domesticated unintentionally, because he found himself near or inside closed, protected structures, in which, as it were, he selected. Certain traits were selected that could never have been selected in nature. It's a type of domestication, then, that involves a domus. That's where the term domestication comes from, meaning a protective, closed structure, an enclosure. Let's put it that way, just to make it clear. In my opinion, if we look at it from this point of view, all these strange, bizarre, counter-evolutionary traits of our species could be put into context. Because let's be honest, being hairless, having the fact of having these prolonged childhoods, the fact of having such painful childbirths, so risky for survival. If we put them in context in a protected, closed environment, then they can, so to speak, be compatible with the survival of the species. All those issues, those traits that, so to speak, put us at a disadvantage in facing other species, prey, predators. If we imagine all this inside a domus, whatever the domus may be, all right, I'm not going into the specifics of the domus. And then, yes, they can develop. And then, yes, even social selection could make sense there. Sexual selection could make sense, because I believe it's impossible that in nature sexual selection is stronger than natural selection. It's impossible. It's not that I choose an individual just because I like the one with hair. Long hair, then it's a trait that can be passed on. But if long hair, let's say, gets tangled, when the woman runs away, she goes into the underbrush, so to speak. In a closed environment, this makes sense. In a closed environment, childbirth also makes sense. Let's say childbirth with obstetric care available. In a closed, protected environment, a prolonged childhood is possible and makes sense, since the young have nothing to fear. So in my opinion, that's how the concept of domestication should be interpreted, which is that our species, at a certain point, not our species, but those who came before us. So we're talking about several hundreds of thousands of years ago, maybe even the Erectus themselves, for some reason, found themselves in a closed, protected environment within which they were able to develop adaptations that in nature, in a natural environment, in contact with other animals, could never have developed. This, let's say, is a bit the point we arrive at. That's the conclusion of this whole discussion, right? All these oddities in the end, if we take them all individually and put them inside an enclosure, if I say Domus, it might be interpreted differently. But if we put them inside an enclosure, then yes, everything makes more sense. Then, if you ask me, what is this enclosure? Well, I don't know. It could be a natural enclosure. It could be, I don't know.
Man shows all the characteristics of a domesticated animal, and the phenomenon could have happened naturally in a place where particular conditions developed. So can we rule out the presence of a selective agent that acted as a filter between what we were and what we are?
Here, once again, we enter murky territory. Why the enclosure? Yes, we can imagine that as well, but if we also include a selective agent, clearly, it's a kind of answer that could somehow also explain the speed of certain events. But it would generate a whole series of questions that become even harder to answer. Because up to the enclosure, Domus, okay, we can also imagine natural cleverness. Of course, I can understand why we're tempted to introduce a selecting agent into this process, because it would make everything much faster. But I don't know. I mean, maybe a selecting agent might not even be necessary. So if we want to, let's say, not be too bold.
Humans could therefore have taken advantage of a natural structure that diverted his evolutionary path and favored unique traits. But why did only man enjoy the privileges of this protected environment? Why didn't other animals benefit from it?
But many of the things we have benefited from, the question remains, what about the other animals? Why are we bipeds and others are not? And why did nature give us a brain like this to be intelligent? And why not the other animals? Other animals don't have to be intelligent. And why is that? Everything that happens to us can easily be transferred to any other species of mammal or primate if we want. And then we have this series of unique traits, which in my opinion are, how can I say, peculiarities that are explained very well in a closed structure, where at that point the forces of nature are dampened, because that's where the whole problem lies. With our equipment in a natural environment, we probably wouldn't survive even today. Let's imagine that today we are heavily shaped by culture in the most varied ways possible. Let's think about hundreds of thousands of years ago when we were particularly stupid and dull, also because we had a brain that didn't work properly. Where was it? It was almost clogged because the circuits weren't forming the way they should. So we were practically, let's say, a sort of plaything for all the other species. If we put it in a closed environment, in a protected environment, then yes. But where was the environment? What was the environment like? Did someone make it? Was it natural? Was there a selective agent? These are all intriguing questions. The problem is that the answers raise unsettling possibilities.
Man has actually undergone a process of domestication. Is this the key to human evolution? If so, was it a natural process or was it guided by someone or something? We will continue to delve deeper into this fascinating topic. Let us know in the comments what you think. If you liked the video, give it a like. See you next time.